Join former FBI senior forensic examiners Becky Passmore and Stacey Eldridge as they dig into the world of digital forensics, one bite at a time. Now leading their own consulting firms and educating the next generation of cyber sleuths, these badass babes of digital forensics bring sharp insight, real-world case experience, and a dose of humor to the bits and bytes that build today's investigations. From deep dives into business email compromise and ransomware attacks, Becky's specialty, to cracking the complexities of iPhone forensics, Stacey's obsession, this podcast delivers insider knowledge for professionals, students, and true crime techies alike. If you've ever wondered what really happens when the digital trail is all that's left, tune in and start parsing the truth.
Welcome back to Parsing the Truth, one bite at a time. I'm Stacey Eldridge, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Becky Passmore. We are the podcast that focuses on digital forensics in today's modern crimes. So yes, we're talking about true crimes, but our unique focus is the facts and artifacts from the digital evidence in these cases. What are the digital forensic examiners doing and saying? That's our focus. Becky, what are we doing tonight?
Well, today we are continuing our coverage of the first Karen Read trial. In tonight's episode, we're covering the testimony of Jessica Hyde, who was called as an expert witness to discuss the digital evidence from Jennifer McCabe's iPhone. If you haven't listened to last week's episode, Season 1, Episode 42, you might want to go back and listen to that first, because that's when and where we discussed Richard Green's affidavit, which ultimately led to Jessica Hyde and Ian Whiffen being called in to work on this case.
And as digital forensic examiners ourselves, we're particularly interested in the digital evidence. And so we're going to use Jessica Hyde's testimony as an opportunity to learn about all the different artifacts that are discussed and also to learn more about what goes on in the courtroom. We're going to share our thoughts to guide you through this awesome learning opportunity. And we're going to make it very clear as we're going through this stuff, like what were the things that were said in the courtroom versus our own commentary. So with that being said, Becky, let's dig in.
Let's go. So Jessica Hyde has taken the stand. The attorney begins by going through her background and experience to get her qualified as an expert. Here are a couple of things of note. Hyde is prior military and is the founder of Hexordia. In this case, Detective Brian Tolley requested her services, and she was specifically asked to examine 2 Google search terms from January 29th and to look at the timelines and the timestamps related to those searches. She also received and reviewed the Richard Green affidavit and Trooper Nicholas Guriano's written report before beginning her analysis. So jumping back to last week's episode, you have to remember that the Green outlined in his affidavit that Jennifer McCabe was searching for house long to die in cold at 2:27 a.m. before John O'Keefe was found.
To get started, Hyde received a copy of the full file system extraction from Jennifer McCabe's phone. She made a copy of it, and then she verified that the hash values matched the original. She explained to the court what a hash value is and why it matters in terms of forensic integrity. And she also listed some of the tools that she used. So she used the ArcPoint Atrio to make that copy. And then she also used some standard industry tools, Cellebrite Physical Analyzer, Axiom, ArtX, iLEAPP, and Sanderson Forensic Browser for SQLite.
So when the attorney asked why she used so many different tools, Hyde explained that different tools have different capabilities. There are so many apps that some tools may not process everything. So you compare results and enhance with manual analysis. Her focus was specifically limited to January the 29th and Safari.
Now, before we get too far into this testimony, we want to point out the 2 searches that are going to be discussed throughout this segment. We talked about it last week. We already mentioned one of them once, but the first search term that came into question is the phrase house long to die in cold. So it's house, HOS was how it was typed. And then the second search term that is going to be discussed is how long to die in cikd. And so it's how long TI die in cikd, CIKD. So just listen carefully, and we're going to do our best to enunciate it, but those are the two phrases that we are talking about. And in her written report, she stated that her task was to understand the timeline of those two different Google searches when they occurred on January. So specifically, the how long to die in cikd and how long to die in cold. Now, on the stand, she was asked whether she looked at anything related to deletion, and she explained that Richard Green had stated in his affidavit that one of the search terms had been deleted, and so she was looking to determine the reason for that suspicion.
So Hyde went on to explain that tools may notate certain things as recovered, and there is sometimes confusion about what the tool means by recovered versus deleted. She actually co-authored a paper on this topic titled Standardization of File Recovery Classification and Authentication with Casey and Alex Nelson, which can be found on Science Direct. We'll link to this document in the show notes if you want to learn more about it. But the thing to know about recovered files is that in the Cellebrite, the recovered artifacts have a red X symbol next to them.
And both of the reports that she mentioned have an artifact called com.apple.mobile.safari.plist. First off, she explained that this name that I just read out loud is a reverse domain. So instead of, you're used to seeing apple.com, this started with the opposite, com.apple. And that's very common. You're going to see this when you are dealing with iPhones, Androids, and that sort of evidence. But she explained that this .plist also stands for property list and that it contains search history. And we want to also point out that there is other data in the plist in addition to the search queries. Excuse me. So it's not just search queries only in this plist file. But another thing you need to know if you're looking for search queries to show up in here in this com.apple.mobile.safari.plist is that it's only going to show up if you are using that search bar that appears on your iPhone directly above the keyboard on the iPhone. If you are on google.com or any other search engine and you're using the search box for that website, it's not going to show up in the plist.
She also found evidence in KnowledgeC.db, which is a system-level artifact. It's an Apple database meant to store information about user activity so the device can determine future functions and suggestions. We want to point out that it logs both system activity and user activity and contains roughly 30 days worth of data.
And she noted that not all of the tools picked up this search for how long to die in cold. She specifically noted that Cellebrite did find it in the WAL file, so WAL, the WAL file record associated with the browser state.db. And sometimes you'll also hear, and this is my commentary, you'll also hear that these artifacts from this database can be referred to as suspended state tabs. You might hear people talk about it that way. You might also see it notated as that artifact type, that artifact category when you're looking at your forensic tools. But so this search, this entry for how long to die in cold associated with the browser state.db is the artifact that was marked as recovered. And based on her testimony at this point, it sounds like Axiom and maybe some other tools have not found this. So we want to make a note to kind of keep track of that as we continue to break down her testimony and the testimony of others as we go forward and see what else is said about the tools and what they did or did not see in terms of this search for how long to die in the cold in the WAL file for the browser state
Right. So then the attorney asked her to define what a WAL file is, and she started by explaining how a SQLite database works. She used an analogy for the SQLite.db database by stating it's similar to an Excel spreadsheet, where a table is like a page in the spreadsheet. All changes go to something like a text file first, and then those changes are written when the spreadsheet is closed, whether you're adding or deleting the data.
I think that Excel spreadsheet analogy for a database pretty standard. I've used it, but I have not had to explain what a wall file is on the stand. So I'm interested to hear what her analogy is for this wall file. So let's go into that now. She actually uses a restaurant analogy to explain it further. And she explains that if you're in a restaurant and you order some food and you need to think of the food as the data, and you're at a table where the table is where it's going to when you request that data. And so you're saying, I'm adding to it, and it can go to an area where the server is going to go grab it from the warming station, which is like the write ahead log. So she's saying, that warming station where the food goes and sits when it's done in the kitchen and then the server's going to bring it out to you, that is kind of like the write ahead log. And so different tables can be ordering food, and food is constantly being put there in the wall file, in the warming station, in her analogy. And so another example she gave was that if somebody's steak came out too rare and it needed to be cooked more, they could send it back, and that would also go to the warming area. So you can see that you've got things going to and from the tables. Things are coming out of the kitchen and things are being sent back to the kitchen simultaneously. So that storage area, in this case, the actual WAV file, or this warming area in the analogy, would contain both the newest stuff that just came out of the kitchen and then the old stuff, which is coming back, which is essentially, think of it as being deleted if you're sending your food back. And so bringing it back to the actual data part of it, she continued. She said, here's what a WAL file contains. It's going to contain things such as your newest searches, your newest messages, as well as anything that has been flagged for deletion. And I personally think this is a really helpful analogy. I pondered it. I don't know that I can think of, I couldn't think of anything better. I think it's good.
I think it's great. I think that it resonates with people in the jury. You know, they can visualize an analogy like this. And that's why making your analogies very clear and something that can be visualized by your jury members. So, yeah, I agree. I think it's a great analogy.
And I don't know if I did enough justice to it when I was trying to summarize it here. So you can certainly go back, and we'll link to her testimony and listen to that snippet. We'll put the timestamp in the show notes. So if you want to hear her explain it really well, you can go and do that as well.
So Hyde also clarified in the context of the WAL file that she means when she says data is marked as deleted in a database context. She's not talking about a user actually taking action to delete this text message. In database terms, deletion means removing data from the database itself. She explained that closing a tab can trigger a deletion event in the database. So it's worth clarifying that the user cannot delete records from the database directly, and they cannot delete records from the WAL file either. So remember, this WAL file is going to be the temporary holding space until the database is closed. The database won't be closed in this case until you close the Safari tab.
Exactly. And since we have this WAL file, we know that Safari was still open when they did the extraction from the iPhone. In another part of her testimony, she touched on the concept of an artifact, and she defined it as any trace that's left behind by any action on a digital piece of data. She also mentioned blob files. So blob is BLOB, And she explained that a blob is used for data that's too large to be stored directly in the database. It could be for attachments or even possibly used in relation to text messages. Now, to dig into this a little bit more, a blob stands for a binary large object. A blob stores binary data.
Mm-hmm.
And it can store all sorts of things. And so you can see like serialized objects, encoded metadata, compressed data, images, audio, protobufs. You'll see all sorts of things in there. It just depends on the specific database and what the app that is writing to that database has been programmed to do. So if you ever see something that says blob, or you're seeing that blob organization, it's important not to skip over them because they can contain very important data. And we talked about it on one other show. We mentioned the tool Rabbit Hole, but that is a great tool to deserialize a blob if you can't read it otherwise.
Exactly. So then Hyde walked us through table 1 from her report, and that was titled Web History Tool Results Combined. We'll also tag this in our show notes, but I'm going to go through this table and define everything that was identified. So it starts with a 2:27 a.m. suspended state tab artifact with the search term of house long to die in cold. The Google search URL and the fact that it's from the browserstat.db-WAL file. At 6:23 a.m., Safari cache record artifact for the Apple suggested the term how long does it take to digest food, along with the cd.smoot.apple.com URL and the fact that it came from the cache.db. At 6:23 and 51 seconds a.m., there was a recent web search artifact for how long T die in cikd. So how long TI die in cikd. No URL is present. It comes from com.apple.mobilesafari.plist. At 6:23 and 56 seconds and 6:23 57 seconds a.m., Google Search App Web Usage Artifact. How long TI die in cikd. Google search URL is present, and the artifact is from the KnowledgeC.db. At 6:24 and 18 seconds a.m., there was a recent web search artifact of how long to die in cold from com.apple.mobilesafari.plist. Then finally, at 6:24, 47 seconds a.m., Google search of house long to die in cold with the Google search URL and that it comes from KnowledgeC.db. You don't get a great view of it in the courtroom, and the public copy of her report could be better quality, so you've got to examine it closely. It begins with a 2:27 a.m. suspended state tab artifact containing the search term house long to die in cold with a Google search URL coming from the browserstat.db-WAL file. Then at 6:23 and 49 seconds a.m., there's a Safari cache record of the Apple suggested term, how long does it take to digest food, coming from cache.
Yeah, we should note if you go and watch her testimony, I don't know if it's just her, but she's probably one of just a couple of people where something happened in the courtroom earlier that morning and somebody was shown on camera on TV that shouldn't have been. And then so the judge made an order that we're switching to Zoom only. And then you can see at the very end of her testimony that she is back on regular camera. So I think that's part of the reason why it's hard to see, because it was on the Zoom. They couldn't control, like tighten the window and zoom in like they had in some of the other people when they testimony. or testified using exhibits shown up in display where you could really get a nice screenshot of what was shown up in the courtroom. Could not happen at all with this report, unfortunately. So we're doing our best here to relay all of that information for you. But continuing on. So going through this table and her discussion, she notes that at 6:23:51 a.m., there was a recent web search artifact for how long to die in cikd with no URL reported. And it is coming from that com.apple.mobilesafari.plist. And then at 6:23:56 and 6:23:57 a.m., there are some Google search app web usage artifacts for that same how long to die in cikd search, along with the Google URL coming from the KnowledgeC.db. And so a side note here, what this is doing is there's two artifacts demonstrating that something happened. So there's that corroboration that as an examiner, you would want to see that. And so you can see that in her table as you read through some of these artifacts. Now, back to her discussion at 6:24:18 a.m., there is a recent web search artifact for how long to die in cold from the plist. And then finally, at 6:24:47 a.m., there is a Google search of how long to die in cold with that Google URL coming from the KnowledgeC.db.
Right. So then Hyde focused on explaining that at 2:27 a.m., a timestamp from the browserstat.db, she explained that the browserstat.db is an artifact that tracks when tabs are moved. When you're using your browser and switching, closing, or minimizing tabs, that timestamp reflects the tab changed state. What's important to take away from this is that this timestamp is not necessarily the time of the search itself.
So keep that in mind. Now, she also explained that if a browser is opened and only one search is made, the times could match. But if the browser has any tab activity, such as closing, minimizing, moving to the background, then that can update that timestamp that is logged. The search term stored there will always be the most recent search term that was in that tab, meaning that the last item open in that tab was house long to die in cold. However, she noted you cannot determine from this artifact alone what time that search actually occurred. And another thing we want to clarify here is, she's talking about Google searches, but this does not mean that the browserstat.db only tracks searches and search terms. She is speaking specifically to this evidence but overall, this database is tracking the last page or the last website that is open in that tab. And so the key takeaway here is that this artifact is tracking what is happening in the tab. It's not tracking the time of the search. And certainly there is website information in there. There is that URL data in there. But the purpose of this database is to track the tab state.
Hyde continues that means the last item that was open in the tab was house long to die in cold, and that we cannot tell by this particular artifact what time that search occurred. There is a high likelihood that this tab was opened at this time because there was another search that occurred at 2:27 a.m. for Hockomock Sports. And there were more searches done immediately after that.
And you can see, this is our commentary here, but you can see this internet history for the Hockomock Sports from the history.db in Exhibit 614. So we'll link to that as well if you want to look more into the internet history, but that's Exhibit 614. Now, Hyde continues that this search term is always going to be the most recent search term in that tab. And again, just to reiterate this does not mean that the browserstat.db only tracks search terms. She's again talking specifically to this evidence It's tracking the last page, the last website, open in that tab, whatever it may be.
That's right. So Hyde shared that the purpose of the browser state.db is actually to allow you to open Safari on your iPhone, then pick up the same tabs on your iPad or Mac. It's what enables that seamless experience across all Apple devices. And so this is important to keep in mind with these types of artifacts. Apple doesn't build them to solve crimes. They're built for a specific user experience purpose. Browserstat.db exists so you can leave your laptop on your desk and pick right back up on your iPhone, say on the subway. So most of these features are also enabled by default because it makes it easier for people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you made there, Becky, about, it's just tracking what's happening so you can go and then pick up where you left off on another device.
Right.
So jumping back to table 1 and the 2:49 a.m. entry that is coming from the cache.db, Hyde explained that this is an Apple suggested term. And so as the user is typing, Apple is trying to anticipate the search and be helpful and suggest something. So in this case, the user is typing, how long to die in cikd? And along the way, Apple is suggesting, how long does it take to digest food? The cdn2.smoot URL in the results indicates that it was an Apple suggestion, not something the user typed, or is what she said. Now, a couple of things we want to point out about this part of the testimony. If you're listening, it kind of sounds like she says smooth for part of the URL, but we checked the exhibits. It is for sure CDN, as in the number, dot smoot with a T at the end. So it's not smooth. But anyways, let's talk about what a CDN is, in case you don't know. So a CDN is a geographically distributed network of servers that delivers internet content quickly, and it's going to be based on your user's location. And so when Apple is suggesting something, it's reaching back to its servers, and then the CDN is going to connect you to the closest one to you for speed, because it's not going to be very helpful if there's like one server and you're on the other side of the planet and it's got to go back and forth to make that suggestion for you.
Right.
And another thing to call out here is that this search is also shown in the KnowledgeC. Which you would expect to see, because the iPhone is tracking this Safari activity at the app level and at the system level. So that's why it's showing up twice.
Yeah, that's right. So then Hyde explained what the timeline would look like if you lined up the activity rather than just the timestamps. It starts with the user beginning to type a search. Apple makes a suggestion of how long to digest food. The user doesn't take that suggestion. The user then inputs how long TTID. Then a search is made for how long to die in cold, which ends up being the last search in that tab.
These typos are horrible for trying to say all these search terms over and over again.
I just rather spell them.
But anyways, it continues. The attorney asked her, and this is prosecution still, asked her why the table showed 2:27 a.m. if the search didn't happen until later that morning. And Hyde clarified that that table is not showing the time of the search. It's showing the last time that tab was touched or moved to the foreground or the background, which was 2:27 a.m. And she says that some action was taken with that tab at 2:27 a.m. when that Hockomock Sports website visit occurred. And then later at 6:24 a.m., the house long to die in cold search becomes the final update, the final web page for that tab. She says that what exactly triggered that 2:27 a.m. timestamp is undetermined, but it is not indicative of when that search was made. And again, to reinforce the point, the timestamp is related to the tab state, not searching, not visiting websites. This database is not tracking your internet surfing. is not tracking your internet history. That happens in a different database where that's its primary focus. But
Yep.
so, it's possible, and this is, us surmising that that tab came into focus at 2:27 a.m. and somehow stayed in focus until 6:24 a.m. We don't know all the different things that happened on the phone. We don't have the evidence. We only have some of the exhibits. Hyde's testimony at the end of the day is she doesn't know exactly what triggered that 2:27 a.m. timestamp, but it's not House Long to Die in Coal being searched at 2:27 a.m.
Yep. So the attorney asked whether there was any evidence of that tab being in use between 2:27 a.m. and 6:23 a.m. Hyde replied that since there is a search at 6:24 a.m., that means the tab was used after 2:27 a.m. So a note here is that there is other searches and browser activity that occurs, but it's not seen in Table 1 because Table 1 is focusing on the searches that were that were typed only. Next, the attorney asks her to explain the intricate artifact that she mentioned earlier. Here's where she discusses the WAL file in more detail. Hyde noted that Cellebrite displayed it where other tools did not, and that you cannot always tell from a WAL file what is waiting to be committed versus what's waiting to be removed.
And so, in order to sort that out, she reconstructed the data using Sanderson's forensic tool for the SQLite browser. And during her reconstruction, she found 16 instances of that artifact entry. But all of these entries had the same unique identifier, which means that it was one search stored multiple times in that WAL file, and it even had multiple offsets. So it was clear from the examination of those 16 instances that it was not 16 separate searches. And I think at this point, we're about halfway through her testimony. She was only on the stand, if you cut out all the sidebars and stuff, for about an hour. So I think we'll stop here and then we'll continue on with her testimony next week. But as we kind of wrap up this episode, Becky, do you have any final thoughts, things you want to point out to people from what we've heard so far as we're digging into the actual testimony?
I think providing analogies, defining terms, being able to set the stage of what the examiner is talking about, posed by the questions that the attorney is asking, really helps the examiners give a very good description of the terms, how they are used, and what is actually happening at the time. So I think being able to explain to our listeners about expert testimony and the use of definitions and analogies is very effective.
Yeah. And I think, there was certainly, we're summarizing it, obviously, but there was technical testimony in there, especially when she's talking about how a WAL file works, and she'll get more into that. But it's definitely some technical stuff going on, and there are definitely times where the attorney kind of loops back around after that and is and basically asking, so what does all of this mean? And so she can kind of give that answer, summarizing all this technical mumbo jumbo that she just said and explain to the jury in ways that they can understand what is the significance of all this stuff I've just said. What is the significance of all this data I've just been talking about? And, in order to do that, your attorney and you have to sort of prep together and be you need to know what he wants to know and get out of you, but he also needs to know the right questions to ask you, because there's got to be that transition, because it's not just like a scripted monologue when you get on the stand and you're like, okay, I'm just going to sit up here and talk for an hour. There's got to be those questions back and forth. I mean, I would love to just get up there and do a PowerPoint presentation about everything I think is important and needs to be said, but it doesn't work that way.
It does not work that way. That is not part of the justice system. Well, all right, everyone. Thank you so much. Join us every week on Thursday as we continue to dive into Karen Reed's first trial. So if you've enjoyed this episode, we're asking a favor. Can you share this with your network? So until next time, stay safe, stay sharp, and as always, keep parsing the truth one byte at a time.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow us to get notified the next time a new episode drops. If you can do more, head on over to parsingthetruth.com and donate by clicking on the donate button. Parsing the Truth is a nonprofit organization, and we are raising money to send a new digital forensic examiner to IASIS training next year in Orlando. Thanks.